بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله نستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ونشهد أن سيدنا مولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله تعالى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our webinar on LGBT and the Islamic perspective to the general discussion around what LGBT means for Muslims. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a 10-minute presentation, inshallah. It'll be quick. And the presentation will really underline the fundamental elements of where we begin our conversation from. And I think it's quite important we address that from those fundamental beliefs from an Islamic perspective. And then what we will do then is we will go on to our esteemed guests and panelists, inshallah, and we'll discuss some of those areas which are quite challenging, quite sensitive in their nature. But inshallah, we'll get the opportunity to hear from their wisdom and from their advice. And inshallah, we will then end with the audience. So this is the opportunity then for you to ask questions, and you can ask our panelists any particular questions that you have in relation to those things that you can identify with in more particular. Okay, so inshallah, let me start by just bringing up my slides. Just one second. So usually the visual solar element allows us to present things a bit more clearly. So just bear with me a second. There's a couple of things that we need to sort of recognize. So we can tackle this subject from a number of different angles. So what we're going to do today, inshallah, we're going to tackle this from an orthodox Muslim narrative. So it's important for us to recognize that, and then we can sort of move from there in terms of the kind of conversations that we have. So first and foremost, it's important for us to understand some very, very important elements. The first thing that we recognize is our deen al-Islam, is the fundamental element of our belief system. And that addresses issues of ethics, it addresses issues related to our mu'amalat, the way we conduct ourselves in terms of our actions, and also our beliefs. So we have a very clear verse of the Quran which relates that understanding. وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَنْ يَكُونَ لَهُمْ خَيْرًا مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. So, and it is for the believing man or a believing woman, when Allah and His Messenger have decided a matter, that they should thereafter have any choice about their affair. So there is some element of clarity. So those things are very sarih, very clear in the Quran and the prophetic tradition. Then there are clear fundamentals of our belief, and that's an aspect of how we then go forth with our worldview. Our worldview is fundamentally based on the Quran and Sunnah. Now, on the basis of this, there are some very, very important verses of the Quran which relate to the subject of LGBT and related topics. So one thing that's important for us to understand is illegal sexual relationships are prohibited in Islam. So what that really means in very simple terms is if there is no nikah, there is no permissibility in sexual relationship. So on the basis of this, the question then arises, what is a nikah and who can that be between? And that can only be between a male and a female, or which needs to be clearly identified. So on the basis of this isn't something that just is an address of a legal paradigm. But in Islam, there is an important drive and motivation towards even prevention. So even the verse of the Quran, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا إِنَّهُ كَانَ فَاحِشَةً وَسَاءَ سَبِيلًا. Don't even go close to fornication. It is indeed a shameful act and an evil way to follow. Now, this is a general paradigm around this idea about sexuality. Now, on the actions that relate to sexuality. Then we have other verses of the Quran which clearly identify issues related to prohibition. So the Quran doesn't just say don't commit zina, it says don't even go close to zina. In other words, those preventative means are a form of sadda zara. They are blocking the means of you even getting close to this concept of zina or fornication. Then there are other verses which address this even more so. So we have قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَيَحْفَظُوا فَرُوجَهُمْ. So tell the believing men that they must lower their gazes and guard their private parts. So this is a preventative element. Now, the whole purpose of this is to identify that in Islam, it's sexual deviancy or even sexual promiscuity in the sense of one which is outside a marital relationship is not only prohibited, but anything that even leads to it would also be prohibited. So on the basis of this, just to emphasize the importance of this, then we can move on to some of the other elements. So more specifically, homosexual acts. Now we have a hadith very clearly that identify this. So we have, for example, the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Inna min akhwafi ma akhafu ala ummati ya'malu 'amala qawmi Lut." So Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam clearly said, "Verily, one of the greatest fears I have for my ummah is that they perpetrate the action of the people of Lut." And following on from that, then we have even verses of the Quran that elaborate this also. وَلُوطٌ إِذَا قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مَا سَبَقَكُم بِهَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِنْ دُونِ النِّسَاءِ بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ مُسْرِفُونَ. And we sent Lut when he said to his people, "Do you commit the shameful act in which nobody in the world has ever preceded you? You come to men lustfully." So this is very specific. You come to men lustfully instead of women. No, you are a people who cross the limits. So this is what we would consider from an Islamic paradigm, sarihatan. It's very clear in terms of these sexual acts to be prohibited in Islam. And there are many other ahadith. I'm just relating another ahadith, which is found specifically in Tabarani, which elaborates in this quite a lot of detail. So there are 4 types of people who the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, who spend the morning in anger of Allah and the evening in the wrath of Allah. They perpetually earn the wrath of Allah, in other words. And he makes reference to this on the basis the man who imitates women, the woman who imitates men, the one who approaches animals for sexual desires, and the one who approaches men. So you can see from this the context in which this is laid out, as well as identifying specific groups and actions. So it's not just about recognizing that the act of homosexuality being prohibited in Islam, but even acts which would lead to that. So even dressing up in a certain gender which is opposite to yours, even those acts would be considered as prohibitions. So following on from there, a very, very important element of this, because what we're doing at the moment is we're forming social constructs of masculinity and femininity and various other things other than masculinity and femininity. So Islam is something which is very clear in identifying a clear theological construct of male and female. So there are many verses which relate this. وَأَنَّهُ خَلَقَ الزَّوْجَيْنِ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى. And he creates the pairs, male and female. يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ اتَّقُوا رَبَّكُمُ الَّذِي خَلَقَ مِن نَّفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ وَخَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا وَبَثَّ مِنْهَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً. O humanity, be mindful of your Lord who created you from a single soul, and from it created his mate, and through both he spread countless men and women. So this concept of sex and its relationship to the understanding of gender correlates 100%. In other words, male sex relates to male gender, female sex relates to female gender. And I will mention that in a short while. But something important to understand is there are boundaries between male and female, and these must be clearly demarcated. So there's a hadith found in Sahih Bukhari, where the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Curse those men who are effeminate, those men who imitate women in their behavior and speech, and those women who imitate men in their behavior and speech." So those, in other words, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam clearly outlined the mukhannithina min rijal wal mutarajjilati min nisa. So these are very clear terms that the Sharihin, the commentators of Hadith, are clearly outlined in terms of their meaning. Then we must not be confused, even from an outwardly perspective, in terms of what your gender is. So this is something that Islam clearly promotes, and it prohibits those people who do not align themselves with this. And that is that your outwardness should also align itself with your sex. So in other words, we have certain hadith that where Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu narrates that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, cursed men who copy women or imitate women, and cursed women who imitate men. So la'ana Allahu mutashabbihina min rijal wa min nisa bin nisa wal mutashabbihati min nisa bir rijal. So this is the fundamental understanding from the orthodox view, and there is ijma on this, there is consensus of this, and anybody who does not understand this, fair enough, there is an element of confusion that exists in society today, but to actually understand and then to reject this would be tantamount to kufr. Now, having clarified that, there are certain philosophical things that we need to address. So that's the fundamentals that we're beginning from. Now we're in a real sense of complexity, and the complexity is the philosophy that underlines all this. And I'm just going to put a couple of points forward, and then inshallah our panelists will address this. So we identify a culture that denies the natural and divinely ordained norms of union between men and women, erasing sexual differences in favor of a utopian, ideological, anti-religious, and anti-scientific and androgyny. Androgyny is referring to being masculine and feminine specifically. So on the basis of this, that's the kind of system that we're living in. That's the kind of system our children have been brought up in, specifically in the West. So if that's the kind of mindset that they are developing, now you can understand how the confusion arises in these children and how difficult it can be for them to understand the Muslim narrative. Now, unlike the haram acts of drinking alcohol and illicit heterosexual sex, the affirmation of same-sex relations and transgenderism is presented as a positive moral cause, undergirded by contentious metaphysical assumptions regarding, among other things, number one. So the idea of you identifying with a certain sex relationship, transgenderism identifies with a couple of metaphysical understandings, which is about the nature of the human self, the place of sex and sexuality in human identity generally, and the proper balance between the individual and society. So in other words, it is no longer just a personal identity that you have, but it extends beyond that into a political, socio-political understanding of your place in society. In other words, you fall into certain social constructs. Those constructs are man-made constructs. So you can be male, you can be female, you can be something in between, you can be X, you can be Z, you can be B, C, D, whatever you want to be. As long as those social constructs exist, then you can fall into those social constructs and you can be identified as something like that. Now, if you're living in a world where that's your mindset, you can imagine the hardship and the difficulty of trying to explain to somebody like that about the Muslim narrative. From Islamic perspective. Then we finally fall. So it's a discourse that appeals to universal notions of human dignity. So this is under which this whole discussion lies now. This isn't just about your sexuality, but it's about human dignity, it's about justice, it's about respect and autonomy. So when we talk about these elements, dignity, justice, respect, and autonomy, we then relate this sense of inequalities based on this idea that somebody wants to identify themselves with a particular gender. So why are you being bigoted in your response to that? So this is the point of contention. So looking from a perspective now, from a very practical perspective, we want to make this very practical in terms of how we discuss this. There is a question about contemporary youth, for example, and how they would address this now. So let's say, for example, somebody comes to the masjid and they approach the imam of the masjid and they ask the question, I identify myself as being gay. What is the Islamic response to that? Or what is the Islamic ruling related to that? And the Imam clearly relates and says it's haram, it's prohibited. Now, there is a mismatch of language, okay? And let me explain that. Even though that sounds like a reasonable response, there is a mismatch of language because you're looking at a young college-going Muslim who generally champions liberal causes in the name of justice and love. To say that being gay is haram might be like saying that being Arab or South Asian is haram to them. So that's how they may understand something that you may be very clear about, but yet they are not. So there is a miscommunication between the two because each is operating from a different paradigm. So on the one hand, we have the Islamic worldview as it pertains to morality and to gender sexuality in particular, which I mentioned earlier on. On the other hand, we have the modern, postmodern secular worldview, which in essence has been indoctrinated in the minds of Muslims. Now, on the basis of this, now you can imagine that this is quite complex. And it's not as simple as just saying it's haram, yeah, even though that may be the general understanding. But how do we, what processes do we go? How do we take on this challenge in addressing this concern, both towards individuals who are Muslims and also to wider society? So before we do that, there are certain terms that will be used. So it's important for us to recognize the definitions. So let me define three things that are important. Number one, gender identity. So how you in your head define your gender based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender. That's an important point to recognize. So this is about your subjective understanding, how you define your gender. So you may be biologically male, as what males suggest, but yet, i.e. from XXXY chromosome, but on the basis of this, you identify yourself as of a particular gender. Then there's something about gender expression. This is the ways you present gender through your actions. So this is about your dress, your demeanor. Again, I mentioned this from the prophetic tradition, how Islam relates to this. And then finally, there is what we call the biological sex. So this is the physical sex characteristics you are born with and develop, including your genitalia, your body shape, your voice, your pitch, your body hair, your hormones, your chromosomes, everything. So this is about the biological sex. So recognizing that these three things are quite different, and we need to address that difference, inshallah, today. So that's me done. And now what I'm going to do is I will, in essence, just mention, just bear with me a second. So let us begin first with our panelists. So first of all, first and foremost, we have Sheikh Dr. Hatim Al-Hajj, a dear friend. Now, Dr. Hatim Al-Hajj is somebody who's doing PhD in comparative fiqh from Al-Jinan University in Tripoli, Lebanon. He's done a master's in Islamic law from the American Open University. He's graduated from both with the highest distinction. He's a board certified in, he's a practicing pediatrician. So he's somebody who comes from a medical perspective and Islamic perspective. And Dr. Hatim Al-Hajj has been one of the leading people in the recent paper that was produced on navigating differences. Some of you may have heard of this paper, Navigating Differences, Clarifying Sexual and Gender Ethics in Islam, which came out very recently, and many people have been commenting about that paper. So we'll get an opportunity to talk to Dr. Hatim Al-Hajj in a short while regarding some of those issues. The next panelist we have Sheikh Fadil Suleiman, who is a Muslim lecturer, a Quran translator, orator, author, filmmaker, game developer from Cairo, somebody who has his hands in many different things. So he's a director of Bridges Foundations, a member of International Union of Muslim Scholars. He's engaged with this topic on a media level, somebody who's addressed some of the concerns that Muslims have related to this topic. So we'll have the opportunity to talk to him regarding some of the socio-political dimensions related to this particular topic. We also have Brother Yusuf Patel, who's the founder of SRE Islamic in 2008, which was established then. He's also a khatib, an activist, an educator. He's established support for Muslim parents who navigate and respond to sex and relationship education, in particular in schools. So that's an important area that we also need to discuss. And then finally, we have Sister Farhat Amin, who is an author. She's written books, including Smart Single Muslimah Hands, Hands Off Our Hijab, and Smart Teenage Muslimah. And she's in essence, discussed some of these really important areas around parenting as it relates to issues around LGBT and sex education. So on the basis of this, we've got an excellent group of panelists, alhamdulillah. Now, let's get into the discussion here. So inshallah, what we'll do is we'll spend a bit of time talking to our guests and address some of these particular questions. So I'm going to first start off by asking a very particular question, okay, recognizing that we understand our fundamentals. So we're going to start off with Sheikh Fadil Suleiman. So one very clear question that does tend to arise generally, are Muslims anti-LGBT? So what's the response to that generally, on a general note? Are Muslims anti-LGBT?
Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. What if Muslims are pro-LGBT? Does it make their actions halal? So when we talk about religion, we don't talk and we don't ask questions like, are you anti or are you pro? Do you love or do you hate? We talk, is it obligatory or halal or recommended or unrecommended or haram? These are the 5 ahkam of the Sharia. So this is when we Muslims talk about that. When the angels ordered Prophet Lut to get out with the believers from the cities before the punishment of Allah comes down on the Qawm Lut, they said in Surah Al-Hijr, فَأَسْرِ بِأَهْلِكَ بِقِطْعٍ مِّنَ اللَّيْلِ وَاتَّبِعْ أَدْبَارَهُمْ وَلَا يَلْتَفِتْ مِنْكُمْ أَحَدًا وَامْضُوا حَيْثُ تُؤْمَرُونَ. So journey with your family at the latter part of the night and follow their rear. Usually the leader is in the front, but here Lot was ordered to be behind the believers, between the believers and the punishment of Allah, as a symbol that the prophethood's teachings is the protector of the backs of the believers from the punishment of Allah. So first of all, we must differentiate between those who practice same-sex encounters and those who just have same-sex attractions. That's why LGBT stands for what? L for lesbians, G for gays, T for transgender, T for the issue is, can we be more specific? Let's make it like that. Those who have same-sex attractions and those who act upon same-sex attraction by doing same-sex encounters, because some people may have same-sex attractions, but they never practice it, and they know it is haram, and they stand away from it, and they abstain from it. Those people are actually muttaqeen, because the definition of taqwa is to know your weaknesses and then stay away from it so that you don't fall into sin. That's what Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu asked Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, what is taqwa? He said, did you ever walk in a street where there are thorns? He said, yes. He said, what did you do? He said, I pulled up my thawb and I was careful where I put my feet. He said, this is exactly taqwa, which means you know what are your weaknesses and then you stay away from falling in sin. So those who have same-sex attractions, but they never act upon it, are good people. Yes.
So Sheikh Fadil, in essence, what you're saying is that these are certain elements that are within human nature, such as our desire for the opposite gender, for example. Yeah. So male, female, that's a natural thing. But even those elements that we have in us, we are prohibited from having sexual relationships, even in that situation, unless there's a state of nikah. Yeah. So that's very clear. And the other point that you're raising, which is a very important.
Can I just cut you here?
Okay.
Because what you said is very important, because what you said means that same-sex attraction, like opposite sex attraction, which is the natural one, both of them can lead people to paradise or to hellfire.
Yes.
Both of them are tests. So that's in essence what you said. That's beautiful, actually.
Now, one thing that I really pick up from what you've said, which I think is really, really important, is that we don't get caught up in the language that the secular paradigm is bringing to us and expecting us to fall into. Are you anti-LGBT? Are you a homophobe? Yeah. So we need to be very careful we don't get trapped in that language. Yeah. So that's important.
Exactly.
Now I'm going to move on to Sheikh Khatim Al-Hajj. Sheikh Khatim Al-Hajj. So clearly there's been a concern here. And alhamdulillah, you know, yourself and a group of ulama and academics have come together to produce a paper on navigating differences, clarifying sexual and gender issues in Islam. Now, this is a very important paper, and many people are making reference to this. Even people from other countries who don't identify themselves as Americans are actually looking at this paper, identifying with some of the language that's being used in there as well, which we'll come to in a short while. Can you just give us a bit of an account about that journey? Why the need for this public statement?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wa rasulullah. Well, first of all, most of us preachers, most of us activists, and most of the scholars would recognize the need to change your rhetorical style to suit the audiences. This is an established Islamic concept. The Prophet ﷺ himself not only changed his rhetorical style, but he even changed his tone, his voice, to basically address different audiences. So we do recognize the importance of this, and we do recognize that the language needs to be sensitive to the circumstances. We know that Ali radiallahu anhu said, speak to people in a way they recognize or they can relate to, they can comprehend, and don't speak to them in a way they find objectionable. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud as well said that whenever you speak to people in a way that they cannot comprehend, it will be a fitna or a trial, a cause of misguidance for some of them. So we do recognize this. We do recognize the importance of this concept.
I'm picking on that point here specifically because I think it's important that people understand that the language that we use in addressing this is important. Recognizing the presentation I gave earlier on about the mindset of youth and the general public, which is sometimes quite secular, quite liberal, and hence the language that we use is essential in how we address some of these issues, especially for us being minorities in a non-Muslim country, for example. Okay, so going to your point, yeah.
So this is as long as there is clarity regarding the Islamic teachings. So once you feel that there is ambiguity or vagueness, then you have to bring about clarity. And that is basically the main objective behind the statement, is the feeling that basically the political correctness of some of us, or there is no scholar at all or a known da'i that has any basically relationship to orthodoxy that said that such practices are permitted or permissible in Islam. However, sometimes the political correctness, to be clear, causes ambiguity. So we felt that clarity is needed, and we felt that we should also empower the Muslim youth with a vernacular that they can use to express their religious convictions, to express their beliefs in a way that is suitable for their basically intellectual milieu. We also were dismayed by the fact that some of the Muslim parents in many counties in America have been denied the right to opt their children out of classes that teach them sort of values that are contradictory to ours when it comes to sexual ethics.
I'm going to pause you there for a short while because I'm going to come back to this important document that you put together with some of these scholars, because there's some really important points that need to be opened up and discussed there. Before I do, following up on the point that you just mentioned, I'm just going to move on to Sister Farhat Amin. Okay, I'm trying to get everybody in, and so that everybody has a chance to speak. So Sister Farhat Amin, Sheikh Hatim Al-Hajj has talked about a concern, and that concern is how this is being put into an education system. So I know you deal a lot with parents, and you tackle this subject from a parental perspective. What are the main fundamental concerns for Muslim parents regarding LGBT? What is the biggest concern? What concerns them the most? I think you're muted. If you can unmute. Yeah,
Okay,
okay.
there we are. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, we can hear
Okay,
you now.
assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for having me on. Yes, so, okay, I can see a lot of the questions that are being posted are by parents, and I'm assuming there are many parents here. And I think one of the biggest concerns, I think the challenge that we're going to face, everything that Brother Sheikh Faisal Suleiman said, how do we make that relatable to our children, that they can understand and connect to the lessons that Allah gives us and the commands and the prohibitions that are there? How do we transfer that into something that our children, and I would say very young children, can understand and accept? Because I think that's the challenge. We have to make it relatable and accessible, because as you all know, through cartoons, books, consistently through the education system. I used to be a high school teacher. It's not, as you know, it's not just SR, the sex education where this is taught. It's becoming, they're being asked to accept it. So we then have to think, okay, how are we going to make our children not accept it and accept what Allah says? And so what my advice to parents would be is that, okay, our children, they may not know, you know, the technical issues regarding human rights. They may not even know the word autonomy. You know, the things that, what has happened is that they're being told, and in a really simple way, that you have the choice to love whoever you want to. You should, therefore other people have the choice to love who they want to. And it's a very sanitized version of you know, what we know is extreme shamelessness and, you know, and these relationships. So I think what parents need to do is we need to focus on really making our children's belief in Islam strong, and by making our family units very strong, so that when whatever we teach them, they then think they love that, you know. And that's quite a difficult, it's not difficult, alhamdulillah, by the will of Allah, and it's possible, and we see it in Muslim families that it's possible. And I think what we need to do is be consistent in, from a very young age, if we teach them what Islam says about family, about love and relationships, and then we show that in our families, as in we live by that, that's really important. And secondly, what they consume is, we have to be very careful, and we have to, you know, the word control, no one likes the word control, but we need to control. I know someone mentioned in the question about movies and cartoons, but I would say even in books, in YouTube videos. As a parent, it's now, we can't be complacent, but it doesn't mean we have to be really fearful either, or paralyzed by this idea that our children are, you know, that we're so scared that our children are going to become, you know, LGBTQ, whichever those letters. But if we think, okay, I'm going to be careful what books my children read, you know, I'm going to be careful what, you know, Netflix show, you know, maybe I'm not even going to let them have access to Netflix. That's what I would say for young children. I'm not going to let them have access to YouTube, or, you know, on demand. So if you're very careful as far as what you allow into your home, but then you're very consistent and careful as far as teaching them what, you know, what our Deen says, and creating an environment. You know, we've all heard the saying, you know, a child is raised by a village. If we, you know, create an environment, whether that's through the masjid, whether it's through family, whether it's through friends, where they're consistently getting that same message regarding this issue, then as they grow up, when they do go to school, or whether you homeschool, when they come in contact with these ideas, because you've given them, inshallah, a strong foundation, and you haven't shied away from talking about these things in an age-appropriate way, and that includes sex education and puberty in an age-appropriate way, they'll then be able to see, okay, that's wrong, because I've always been told that's wrong. And they'll,
So you're addressing some of the ways that parents should relate to this and address it. But more in particular, what I'm picking up from you is the idea that there is a serious concern amongst parents that the kind of understanding that Muslims have about family, about ethics of family, about the cohesion of family, about the kind of relationships that individuals have in family, how we relate and how we have progeny. The whole idea is there's a counter narrative to that in terms of how kids are being taught this in schools, which goes clearly against some of the really essential values that we have, what parents in essence should be teaching their children. We're having something that is quite contrary to us. It's causing a lot of confusion in our kids. Now, I'm just going to move on to Brother Yusuf Patel. So Brother Yusuf Patel, you're somebody who's been very active in this area for quite a number of years. If you recognize, a lot of people know the kind of work that you're doing, alhamdulillah. What's your approach? What are you advising Muslim parents to undertake in dealing with religious and relationship and sex education? What's your approach? How should parents deal with this?
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim Maliki Yawmiddin Wassalatu Wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad bin Abdullah Khatam al-Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Jazakallah khair for the invitation. I think there's two elements here that I want to speak about. One is around RSE in schools, relationship and sex education in schools, but other is about how we tackle it in the homes, because we can't just almost deal with one without dealing with the other, because of the nature of LGBTQ type ideas being prevalent across societies. And so in schools, I think parents need to take a much more active part in the way that children are being taught. Now, there's lots of different discussions about whether children should be home educated, whether children should be in school. The reality is, most of the time, most children will be in state schools. And we've got to if we do send our children to state schools, we've got to do that with our eyes wide open. And we've got to recognize that we have, once we send our children to those schools, it's not as if we take a passive status after that in just sitting back and just expecting the school to deliver something to our children. Because sometimes we are very overly trusting of schools and what they teach. We've got to really ask lots of questions about what they're teaching. Just asking questions to a school gives the impression to a school that we care about that. Most schools will say, look, most parents don't ask us any questions, so they're not really concerned about that. They'll assume that we don't really care if we don't ask questions. Asking questions and then challenging things when necessary in a way which says to the schools, look, you're teaching my child. I'm the primary stakeholder of this school. And so you've got to, in essence, listen to what I say and factor into the equation my concerns as a parent. There's issues around schools which we can go into around details, but in the home as well. We've got to build a firm foundation in our children. Most children I speak to, when I go and speak to children and say, I ask them, why are you Muslim? The number one answer for Muslim children is because my parents are Muslim. And that's unacceptable, because the reality is we're not just saying, we're not saying to a child, what's your favorite food? What's your ethnic background? We're saying to a child, why are you Muslim? Which is the answer to is the answer to our meaning and purpose in life. Why I was created. It's the very idea of why I'm here upon this earth. And therefore how I should function in everyday life, in my relationships, in my conduct, in the very essence of how I understand my mission and goal in life. So we've got to build a clear idea from the Quranic narrative around our children's understanding of why they're Muslim, because it's built upon the truth. Secondly, we've got to really start focusing much more on the importance of family. In this turbulent world around our children, family is going to be the source of stability in a chaotic world. So we've got to leverage this important characteristic, important value from Islam, the cornerstone of most of fiqh around relationships is built upon family.
Yes.
And so we've got to really leverage that, and primarily, and fathers and mothers have both got to take responsibility for raising their children. It's not that the mother now fulfills that role, the father plays an important role. There's lots of research about the importance of fathers, and in terms of in showing love to their children, showing praise, giving quality time to their children, showing the child that they're valued, and role modeling what it means to live life in this world and navigate this world. So primarily, children need to feel loved and need to
Yusuf, in essence, you're reiterating this very same points of Sister Farhat was mentioning about recognizing what family means, what it means to be in a relationship. These are very, very important discussions. Yet what we're doing is we're relying, and this is the point that you realize, we're relying on a secular institute to actually imbibe those values into our children. Yet we need to be the examples in our homes. And at the same time, you mentioned, this is a very important point, and that is we must ensure that we are not passive bystanders when it comes to the kind of education that our children are having in schools. We can't afford to be, because it's having so much damaging effect on our children. So that's a very, very important point. We're going to come back to that point again, but I'm just going to move on, because we see Sheikh Fadil Suleiman, we see, all these news articles, we see small videos, put on social media about lots of Muslim parents out there shouting outside their schools, all sorts of statements that are being flown around, and people who are exploiting them, and then saying, Muslims are bigoted about their views about LGBT. How do we address that narrative? What advice would you give about how we address this narrative, that this so-called statement that Muslims are bigoted in review and in addressing this issue?
Thank you very much, Sheikh, for this question. But before addressing this question, I need just to add something to what Dr. Sheikh Hatim Al-Haj said, and what Brother Yusuf said, and what Sister Farhat Ali said.
Okay.
The most important thing in dealing with our youth, because we see that we are being infiltrated now. We see some of our youth are talking in a tone that sympathizes with this movement to an extent. We need to refute the misconceptions. There are many misconceptions about what do I do? It's all about love, not sex. I found myself in love with my friend or whatever. These things should be refuted. Many of these misconceptions can be refuted. All of them actually can be refuted very professionally. And we need to increase to raise the level of critical thinking in our children so that they can protect themselves. If we are not all the time with them and can protect them ourselves, we need to show them how to protect themselves. Regarding your question, the reason why Muslims are seen as bigoted, because many Muslims now think like we are at the end of times. Many Muslims are depressed because of that corruption became everywhere. Atheism is spreading. LGBTQ ideology is spreading. And many of us are wondering, are we at the end of times? In my opinion, which is by no means important, but no, we are probably not at the end of times. At every era, shocking events happened and people thought that they were at the end of times. And it appeared that they were not at the end of time.
So,
in the 11th
on the
century,
basis of this, do you think that we should be very open about this and very clear about this? Or do you,
no.
Because sometimes we can be very easily swayed in a social narrative, can't we? That we Muslims should portray. I mean, this is a question of debate. I'm asking you this question.
I don't mean that.
Question to you first.
Yeah.
Because what Muslims think, and this is a mindset amongst Muslims, that we need to show a sense of integration into wider society, and hence we should be careful how we address this issue, because it's a very sensitive issue. What you're saying, in essence, or correct me if I'm wrong, is certain things are so fundamental to our faith, we need to be very clear, regardless what people perceive as us. Is that what you're saying?
Of course, we have to be very clear, but at the same time, we need to stop whining and start working. Because that's what I was about to say, that in the 11th century, 1 million crusaders marched through Europe and swept through the Muslim world, killing tens of thousands of civilians, looting, plundering, and raping, and establishing 4 Christian states in the middle of the Muslim world. And people said, we must be at the end of times. And it appeared that we are not at the end of times. All what happened is a generation of Muslims appeared who stopped whining and started working, and they defeated them. After 200 years, same thing happened. The Mongols swept through the Muslim world, killed the Caliph in Baghdad, killed over 1 million Muslims in Iraq alone, and people said, we must be at the end of times. And then a generation appeared who stopped whining and started working. Today, they are invading us again, but ideologically. Atheism, LGBT ideologies, they're sweeping through Muslim communities. People need to stop saying we must be at the end of time, because this leads to stagnation. No, wake up and smell the coffee. We need to stop whining and start working. Allah has chosen you and has chosen us, the Muslims, at that time, like he chose Salah ad-Din and his generation, and like he chose Qutuz and his generation to stop the Crusaders. So he chose us to work against these ideologies. All we need to do is to plan properly and work, and to be actually excited for being chosen by Allah to stop this. And if anyone thinks that Islam cannot defeat these ideologies, that he should go actually and look into his beliefs and conviction. Islam is definitely stronger than any other ideology.
Yeah,
all
so
we
I
need to
mean,
do is
they
have
were
a strong
clearly the
conviction.
chosen people. كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس.
Of course.
What I mean, that's very clear, and you've addressed it in a very clear language, I think. Now, talking about language, I'm going to go back to Sheikh Khatim Al-Hajj. I really want this to be really practical in terms of how we respond to this, because sometimes when we use words, they don't really give us a true sense of what that actually means. So Sheikh Khatim Al-Hajj, going back to this particular document, this paper, using the words that are being used, and I'm sure you spent quite a bit of time thinking about the terms. Peaceful coexistence does not necessitate agreement, acceptance, affirmation, promotion, or celebration. I think they're very, very important words. But they could mean different things to different people. And I think people have misunderstood them. I'm sure people have approached you about some of their understandings related to how these words could be used. So could you just elaborate, in particular, the words? So, for example, when we say it doesn't necessitate agreement, acceptance, what does that actually mean? So that's the wording that you've chosen, but what does that actually mean? Agreement and acceptance.
Yes, alhamdulillah. As you may be aware, certainly the statement has been critiqued from the right and the left, and basically some people are unhappy with the leniency of the statement, and some people are unhappy with the harshness of the statement. That's always expected, and if you try actually to be to have like a moderate tone, then it is expected that you will be blamed from both sides. So when we talk about peaceful coexistence, I think that most of the Muslims do believe that Muslims are in the West for the long term, and they do believe that we are part of the social contract. They do believe that we want integration without disintegration of our identity, integration into the larger society without disintegration of our identity. So we want to
integration, but not assimilation, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So peaceful coexistence, basically, when in the recitation of Hamza, اتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام in Surah An-Nisa, in the beginning of Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and fear Allah through whom you claim of each other your rights, and al-arham. So in the recitation of Hamza, al-arham is al-arhami, not al-arhama. And there is basically a difference in meaning here. So you ask or you claim your rights of each other through Allah and through al-arham, through the womb, through kinship, through your relationships. This was their social contract. They claimed the rights of each other through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their social contract. They used to say, "Anshuduka billahi wa rahim." I ask you by Allah and our kinship or relationship. So the social contract for those people used to be tribalism, etc. There is a different social contract, and we're part of the social contract. The jurisdiction of Islamic judiciary does not actually extend beyond the borders of the lands of Islam. Therefore, we are not basically demanding the application of Islamic punishments against any particular practice or this or that outside of the land of Islam. This is the jurisdiction does not extend beyond the borders. We want peaceful coexistence, but at the same time, we do not want people to force on us accept agreement and acceptance, and sometimes even celebration. Like sometimes you can't even stay silent. Sometimes you have to be coerced into pronouncing your agreement, your acceptance, your embracing of values that are at odds with your own, that are contradictory to your own. So we wanted to just make it clear, and we wanted to make it clear that we know where we are. We know that we are part of the social contract, meaning that we are abiding by the laws of the land, and certainly abiding by the laws of the land for a Muslim. When there is a conflict, then there is conscientious objection, and there are ways of addressing the conflict when there is a conflict. And oftentimes there is no conflict, but when there is a conflict, there are ways of addressing it. So we wanted to say that we're part of the social contract, we're abiding by the laws, but we will not basically give up or compromise, give up on our values or compromise them. And we will have to be clear about our values among ourselves, and also contribute to the larger or to the sort of the wider societal discourse on these matters from basically our perspective and our worldviews, our values.
So in essence, and I get that, and it's important. It's a very important point again, because what we're recognizing is the Sharia. When you look at the Sharia, number one, we're addressing two different contexts. We're talking about a system which is under the Sharia law, and we're talking about a system which clearly is not under Sharia law. So living in the West, in essence, we're living in a secular system. So we need to identify and recognize that we have a political sort of system that is not Sharia, right? That's the first sort of, and that is a context that we have to address from our sources from Islam. Now, on the basis of that, we also, it's very easy for us to be activists and then stand up and say, look, this is prohibited in Islam and we should address this, we should be actively against this. So that's one way of dealing with it, and that can be an approach. But rather, when we're talking about an approach which is holistic, identifies the social political paradigm, recognizes the legal understanding of the system that we're living in, and also recognizing our ethical code as being Muslims, minority Muslims in a country which is clearly majority non-Muslim, then we have to be careful in terms of how we approach that subject and how we address it on paper, because that's what you've done. You've addressed this on paper, and we know that you will be quoted for those particular words, word by word. So we have to use a sense of hikmah in how we address that. So there's some very important points that you've raised, and I want to address this, because this I think, as a parent myself, I think this is the bit where it really gets to me, and that is that there's this understanding that we must promote LGBT and we should celebrate it as well. And I know that even the school where my kids go, that is the kind of agenda that's being put forward. They must promote it. Let me give you an example. So one of the teachers in one of the classes of my children, she stood up in front of the whole class and told the class that she identifies herself as being homosexual. Now, would I ever do that in a class and stand up and say, by the way, I just thought I'd let you all know, but I am heterosexual. And I just thought that, you know, I'll let you all know. That's a sexual orientation, you know. What's that got to do with anything? So there's this understanding about, you know, celebrating this and promoting this, which is a fundamental issue for Muslims at the moment, which I think is causing some of those frustrations that Sheikh Fadil Suleiman has mentioned also. I'm just going to go to Sister Farhat again, and I know Sister Farhat is only going to be here for a short while now. So, Islamic sex education for Muslim girls. Okay, how should communities work together to educate our children on that? We're looking at solutions now. So we're going to talk about solutions in the next sort of half an hour. So looking at the sex education for Muslim girls, this is a big issue. We're discovering there are certain schools where there is a lot, even Muslim schools, where there are Muslim girls, well, in fact, all of them are Muslim girls. And we're hearing that there's a bit of a trend going on in some of these schools, where some of those girls are identifying themselves as being homosexual. That's an issue. Yeah. So what's happening? What advice would you give regarding Islamic sex education for Muslim girls? How should communities work together to do this, to deal with this?
Well, firstly, fathers and uncles and men, they should be teaching the boys, and it should be the women teaching the girls. That's the first thing. But I think, like I said, it has to start from a young age. And okay, if your children are now teenagers, but what I would just say, from a young age, if we explain, you know, when you're reading the story about Adam alayhi salam and Hawa, may Allah be pleased with her, you know, just explaining the creation of, you know, how Allah created human beings, how Allah created each generation. I think there has to be that, we have to have that in our mind, that is so fundamental. You know, English tuition, maths tuition, science tuition, that's fine. But if we're not giving our kids an Islamic education, like that's the most important thing, there's something wrong here. And if, you know, we just need to get that into our heads. I like what the Pope said about we need to try no more complaining or moaning. We have to be proactive. These are our children. These are our nieces and nephews, you know, and this is our reward. This is our responsibility. This is what we will be accountable for. It's no one else's job. Alhamdulillah, we can get together and do things together, but I will be accountable for my kids. You will be accountable for yours. So let's really make this a priority. Okay, regarding teenage girls and boys, I think if we need to think about how, okay, if it's your daughter you're concerned, or your son, you need to have a good relationship with them. And if you haven't got a good relationship with them, do something. You need to start thinking, why? Why is it that my child may be having these ideas, but they don't feel they can talk to me? So that's not about LGBTQ, that's about your relationship with them. So make an effort to get on with your child. I'm not saying use acquiesce to everything they want and give them, I'm not saying spoil them and do everything, but think about, have I spent enough time with them? Am I approachable? Am I kind to them? Am I basically like the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? And if, let's say you don't know how to be like the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, so read the books on Seerah. I think we have to work on our parenting so that our children, if they're thinking, oh, if I tell them, my mum, that I spoke to a boy, or if a boy came up to me, or, you know, a girl came up to me, if they're just going to blow their top, that's not good. So firstly, work on having a good relationship with your children. And that means, and that's like, I really like what Brother Yusuf said, it's not just the mum and dad, it's mum and dad. Like, don't prioritize working and making money. That's not the priority, you know, because there's a range where your child will, let's say about from up to the age of 11, 12, if you haven't got a good relationship with them, they then move on to their friends. And then this is the thing, if their friends, whatever their friends are into, they will listen to them, they will take advice from them, and you become just, you're just a parent who they kind of tolerate, or they ignore, or you're just like someone who gives them money and food. So work on your relationship. Now, as a community, I think, I know many masjids are doing a very good job about this, but I'll tell you an example. I wanted to start youth. I was talking to women, parents, after I wrote my book, Smart Teenage Muslim. I had a lot of parents emailing me saying we would like our daughters to go to some kind of youth group, go to some kind of community event, be able to go to the masjid, because that's where they want them to then have a good environment. But there wasn't that access. Now I know in the UK anyway, there's an issue with space, and that's fine. But as masjids and communities, we need to think, how can we create environments that our teenagers will want to come and listen to us? We put our money, put our time, and we invest into those kind of events. And like I said, so then the young women can talk to the younger teenagers about SRE, about puberty, about these, about LGBTQ, as well as other issues, about the seerah, about wives of the Prophet, who are the good role models. And so rather than going onto the internet to get all the information and following, whether it's Muslim or non-Muslim influencers who are very pro these ideas, they're then thinking, no, weekly or every, twice a week, I have another source of knowledge and these are real people. These aren't just people who I'll never meet.
I mean, it's very important what you're saying. I'm sort of addressing some of the challenges that some parents have related to this. Having a good relationship with your children sometimes can be a cultural thing that you may have. It may be something that you've never had that kind of relationship with your parents. It can be sometimes quite difficult for parents to do that. But also, I find, and I addressing some of these concerns with some parents that I come across, some of the points that sometimes they put forward to me is that our children, their minds have been filled in with how to respond to the narrative. So when they get educated in this area, when they go to school, they're told how to respond to this narrative. So in other words, they'll come to you and say, Mom, Dad, you don't understand. Yeah. There's this thing about equality. They should be allowed to do that. Well, there's that kind of narrative that they come with. So, so parents sometimes can't address that because they're not very read in that area. So when we look at a community setup where this is happening at a community level and kids are being clearly educated on this area by somebody who does have that understanding, who is able to address that, is this something that you think is more feasible? I recognize that parents do have a role, but sometimes it can be very intimidating for a child to approach their father or mother to talk about something really as sensitive as this.
Okay, that's true. So, but one thing I am going to just maybe I'm aware of this because I was a high school teacher, and when you're hearing it, and actually there were certain lessons I would have to teach, but I would just refuse to teach certain things. That's when they didn't used to monitor certain things with my form class. So you're right. Maybe if you're reading about, and also if you made an effort to but then it's also time. I'm not criticizing any parent who hasn't got the time to read about these things, but then let's educate ourselves. So one thing I would say is we do have to make our priorities. So alhamdulillah, we have got it completely sorted when it comes to Ramadan, fasting, Quran, Salah. We know those things, and that's good, and we make an effort to learn it, and we teach our children that. And now we need to realize that we're living in a different era where we're going to, as parents, when we are choosing to bring our children up in a non-Muslim country, because we're choosing to do that. I know not everyone can do hijrah, so I totally understand that, but it's a responsibility. It's a level of education. We have to educate ourselves. So we read up on books. This webinar is, alhamdulillah, Allah reward you guys for organizing this, and that we educate ourselves. And then we do need to talk to our children. We have to remove some of that, whether it's shyness or whatever is preventing us from making ourselves approachable and letting our children talk to us about that. We have to work on that. If we can't, then it's the thing of are there younger people in our family? So we're the 20-year-olds that can talk to them. So it might be our younger brothers and sisters, their uncles or aunties. And then as a community, we have to really take this bull by the horns and say, whether it's through our masjids or whether it's through community talks that we organize or workshops, we have to do what the teachers and the schooling is doing to our children. We have to create an alternative for that. And that isn't going to be easy, but that is what we have to do. And the reward is immense. But it's a change in mentality as a community that we have to do this, or we are going to have our children turning up and saying, I feel homosexual.
In essence, this is a fardi kifaya. It's a community obligation.
It really is.
So we have a system in place where, so enough of the moaning and groaning, in essence. Let's get on with this. Let's establish spaces within our community.
Yes.
Clearly address this head on. So
Yeah.
even in things like, for example, I mean, I know a lot of makatib here where they taught fiqh of salah, fiqh of of many different topics. The fiqh of marriage, the fiqh of nikah. Yeah?
Yes.
What does that mean? Make it very clear. And some excellent pieces of work that's been written in terms of how you address issues related to educating children about salah, educating children even about complex areas like zakah, for example. But how much do we have in terms of an area dedicated to where we teach the fiqh and the Islamic sort of understanding in the context, contemporary context, about the fiqh of nikah, and the fiqh of talaq, and various other areas, which are clearly big issues in society today. So, alhamdulillah. Sister Farah, I know that you are going to have to go, and I also understand that you're not being well. So, inshallah, may Allah give you shifa kamila, inshallah. And thank you very much for coming to the webinar, inshallah. And Allah reward you. Jazakallah khair. So I'm going to go to Yusuf, because we've talked about some very, very important points here. Come on, Yusuf, let's get to the point here. Right. So we got a vision about what relationship sex education should look like. Or do we have a vision? I don't think we have. So we're addressing the issue. We're just saying that we're not happy with this. What should it look like in schools for Muslims in particular? What is it that we're aiming at?
I think we shouldn't just, I think maybe restrict it just to schools, because the needs of our children won't be met. If we're talking about state schools, the needs of our children won't really be met in state schools. But what I believe is, as a community, we need to, for example, one thing I'm doing at the moment is finalizing a maktab curriculum. And I've been in touch with lots of makatib about this, like a holistic maktab curriculum. It doesn't just deal with RSE or topics around LGBTQ as a standalone topic, but teaches it within a holistic perspective around around the link between their Islam and the way they relate to people, the way they relate to relationships, the way they understand all of these things from a holistic perspective. But I think, there's certain things that parents can really do in relation to LGBTQ, because I think we need to first recognize that there are certain narratives out there around LGBTQ issues. Yeah. And one of the major narratives that is affecting children, and sometimes we don't help in the language that we use, is that they say that they talk about identity, and they say identity is what somebody has almost as an innate characteristic. So as everybody is born with a sexual orientation or sexuality as an identity that is unchangeable and unchanging. And this is there's no science which backs that up. There is no that's not based upon any reality. That's just based upon a worldview, based upon postmodernism, which is based upon an idea that morality is shifting. There's no such thing as epistemological truths. But I think one of the things that we need to teach our children practically is this idea that that every desire can be fought, every feeling can be struggled against. Because the nature of the society in which our children are being brought up is that they are being taught that you should give in to your desires, should give in to your drives. If you're attracted to somebody, just fulfill that. And that goes against the very essence of Islam, which is about submission and about controlling desires. And these simple building block ideas, like the very idea to say to it that when a young Muslim says, look, I'm struggling with my same-sex attraction, this is built on sometimes an idea that who I am attracted to almost defines who I am as a human being. And this is a very materialistic conception of life. That's serious confusion in terms of identity. Sorry?
I said there's a serious confusion in the identity of your person. It's questioning your identity now.
And absolutely, what we should really teach our children is, look, a feeling comes to the mind. You can respond to it, or you can fight against it. And as Muslims, we are created to fight against our desires, because this very nature of our existence is temporary. This is not Jannah. Our Jannah is coming. And what we do on this life matters in relation to our purpose and our meaning in life and meaning of our life. So I think we teach our children simple things like, you don't give in to your feelings. you can fight any desire, even if you ever commit a sin. Yeah, that is not the end of your life. That is not that is a reflection of you being a human being. You can make tawbah, and you should make tawbah. One of the things we should teach our children is, one of the things that they're trying to do is normalize sin. And tawbah is an excellent way of disrupting the normalization of sin, because by when you commit a sin, you recognize that it's a sin against Allah, you regret it, and you promise Allah that you'll never do it again. And these three almost play into this idea of sin is not something that defines who I am. It's a weakness that I've succumbed to, that I can make good on by making tawbah to Allah. The doors of tawbah are always open to anybody. And also, we've got to really change the narrative around love, the way we discuss love in our communities, and even the way we discuss sexual matters within our communities. In our communities, sometimes we discuss sexual matters as if it's taboo. We shouldn't talk about it. Within a context of understanding how to live life as a Muslim, there is a place for that discussion to be had. Unfortunately, sometimes the impression we give to our children, don't come and speak to me about it. Speak to me about algebra. Speak to me about science. Speak to me about any other question. Ask me any other question, but don't speak to me about sexual matters. But if our children don't come to us to ask about those matters, where are they going to? Yeah, are we allowing them to go elsewhere where the very values which underpin those answers are going to be from a different worldview from us? So if they go to a teacher, if they go to Google, if they go to any other place, essentially we're opening up avenues for them to be cultured and taught in a way that is in opposition to our very worldview, our very values as Muslims.
Well, I suppose one really important aspect of our worldview is وَلَا تَتَّبِعِ الْهَوَىٰ فَيُضِلَّكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Yeah. So don't follow your desires, for they will take you against the path of Allah, move you away from the path of Allah. So this idea of controlling desires is an essential part. Controlling your nafs is an essential part of our worldview in terms of how we perceive the model of ourselves. And I suppose on the basis of, even the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "La yu'minu ahadukum hatta yakunu hawa'an tab'an lima ji'tu bi." That none of you should, is a true believer until your hawa, your desires, are in line with what I brought you, i.e., the Sharia. So clearly, there is a very important aspect of our deen, and what children are being taught is, if you have a certain desire, a feeling, you should ventilate it. Allow it, let go of it, and embody that. So even that as a fundamental issue is concerning, regardless of, relations to sex education. There's a fundamental element of our deen, what it's teaching us, that is being taught contrary to in our schools. So that's a fundamental issue in itself. And hence, opening yourself to sin, opening yourself to other issues related to sexuality, masturbation, pornography, many other areas that clearly come into this. So very important. Now, I'm going to move on to Sheikh Father Suleiman. So we know the narrative. We've sort of talked a bit about the way we should address it. And Brother Yusuf mentioned some really important things. And that is that we should address the syllabus in terms of, the RSE in schools directly. Reality is children. They're around, they're mixing with all sorts of interesting people, and your child may come home and say, by the way, I have somebody who's a friend or somebody I know, I get on with them, and they've just told me that they're still identifying themselves in terms of their gender. Now, that sounds quite strange to some people, but yet to them, it's quite normal. Yeah. So they're still deciding which particular gender they want to be. Now, how should Muslim children in particular, because they're challenged with this probably more than even adults are, interact with people who identify themselves in this way?
With my children, I tell them, we are surrounded by pubs and gambling clubs. How do we deal with people who go and practice gambling and drinking in both of them? Just fairly. I don't deprive them their rights, and I don't have to be a close friend with any of them. This is legal, this is fair, and I need to be fair with everyone. I choose the people who can be my close friends, who are like me, and who can increase me in Iman and in good deeds. And I don't exaggerate over that. I don't need to tell them what is the punishment for people who do that in Islam, because this punishment is not going to be applied in the West. And we are not entitled to apply this in the West. We don't even apply it in the East or in the Muslim world. So why go that far with the children? We don't need to do that. But you mentioned something very important, Sheikh. They tell you, I have a friend. Okay. The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-mar'u ala dini khalilih. A person follows the way of life of his close friend. Be their close friend. So what I want to talk about here is the main cause of same-sex attraction is actually the main cause of atheism itself, which is what is called the missing father syndrome. This book is called The Faith of the Fatherless, written by Paul Davis, one of the biggest psychiatrists in America. And he's speaking about the faith of, or the losing faith when it comes to missing the father. Same thing exactly. Same-sex attraction, especially in males, is a symptom of what is called the attachment disorder. When someone doesn't have a good relationship with his father, and he doesn't have at the same time brothers to play with him, and he's too shy to have friends, if he continues like that until puberty, he can be looking into this missing attachment with his own sex in sex. So what we need to do is to spend as much as we can, what we call quality time. Quality time is when you don't act as a parent. You act only exactly as a friend. When Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was crawling on his knees with 2 children on his back, and he looked back to them and said, "Ni'ma al-jamal jamalukuma," what a good camel you have. He was not wasting his time. He's a very important person. He doesn't have time to waste. He was spending what is called quality time. It's a time when you just act like a child, exactly in the age of the children that you are playing with. When he spoke because he was speaking to 3-year-old children, he told them, "What a good camel you have." This is the narrative of a 3-year-old. When he talked to an older child who lost whom his bird died, he talked to him in a narrative of 6-year-old. He told him, "Ya Umair, ma fa'ala al-nughair." It's a pun that can bring a smile to his face, and it's suitable for a 6-year-old. So this is how it is. We need to spend quality time with our children. How do we do that? When you go back home, leave your mobile phone, stop sending Jum'ah Mubarakah messages to all your WhatsApp groups, and spend this barakah time with your children and play with them. Be their Khalil, be their friend, to the extent that they come and tell you things and they don't shy from speaking to you, as the sister was speaking, that children shy from speaking to us. That's because you have made barriers between you and your children. So this is mainly what we need to do. RSE is not only to teach children. Sheikh Yusuf, it is your responsibility to teach parents how to protect their children. One of the things we were told, don't say no to someone elder. This is wrong. We need to teach children that no is a good word. They need to learn to say no to everyone except dad and mom and God. That's it. The one who will give them a cigarette is older than them. So when you program your child not to say no to someone older, he will not say no to a child who is older than him, giving him a cigarette. Same thing, the pervert who will take the child somewhere and rape him, you are programming your child to be submissive. No, we need to teach our children how to protect themselves with no, with being creative, having critical thinking. When I speak to them, tell me what's happening these days in schools. So they say, "Yeah, Ammo, they do this, they do that. They keep telling us this and that." And I tell them, "How much do they charge you for this?" They say, "Nothing." "Nothing? Is it free service?" They say, "Yes." I said, "No, believe me, there is nothing for free in this world. When someone is giving you a free service, you need to know that you are the merchandise and you are being sold to someone else." And then I speak to them about, like, transgender operations that cost $75,000. And by increasing the number of customers like that, we are talking about $1 trillion business coming, and you are sold. So I teach the children to be critical, have critical thinking, not to believe anything said. A chemistry teacher is a chemistry teacher. I will take chemistry from him, and that's it, nothing else.
Yeah.
Not when he talks about religion. Yes. By the way, I want to tell you this.
Yeah.
We developed 4 games. You introduced me as a game developer. Yes, I have 4 games that protect from atheism.
Right. Okay. Sure.
Yeah. So the issue, yes, and we are embedding these things in them.
Yeah,
it's actually just teaching children certain logical way of thinking so that they don't submit to any narrative that they hear. We cannot protect our children anymore.
So, in essence, what we're really saying is we need to build a sense of resilience, and that resilience will come, number one, from the parents first and foremost.
Of course,
and that
definitely
requires us to let go of those negative cultures that we have about parental-child relationship that some of us have, let's be honest, where we have a formal relationship with our children. We need to scrap it. It's not worth it. The kind of relationship you need to have with your children now is a friendship type relationship, maybe even.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, this seems to be an important thread that's going through every one of our panelists, that we need to really start looking at how we are parenting, how we're relating to our children, because this is the fundamental element of resilience that we're building in them. Sheikh 𝐁𝐚𝐿, you're going to address this now from a different perspective, and that is the perspective not from a child perspective, but from a professional perspective. Now, you've got another hat, which is the fact that you're a pediatrician, you're a physician. Now, we address these issues clearly, and we are taught, and I am a physician as well, and some of the things that we come across people like this regularly, our patients, families who identify themselves LGBT, transgenderism, so forth. What advice would you give somebody who clearly has a deep understanding of the Islamic sciences, somebody who has a deep understanding of practically being a professional working in this kind of environment? What kind of advice would you give to professionals, not just only physicians maybe, but maybe even a generic advice that could also be applied to teachers and various other people? Because I know a lot of teachers who are really frustrated. Muslim teachers are really frustrated about this as well. And I know now more so getting regular responses from Muslim physicians who are getting quite frustrated, as well as confused about how they should deal with this from an Islamic perspective. Sheikh, what advice would you give?
Alhamdulillah, if I may quickly address the issue that I talked about last time I was talking, I talked about the issue of the government basically quitting being a neutral peacemaker and acting, as a protagonist of a certain worldview, proselytizing, and that is actually happening. And in order for us as a Muslim minority in the West to succeed in maintaining our identity, we also have to figure out what kind of world we want to live in. If we want to live in a world where the majority will basically shape their society according to their values, their religious values that may be closer to our values, no matter how far they are from our value system, they are still closer to our value system than basically having no value system whatsoever and no anchorage whatsoever, which is what is happening. The type of liberalism of John Locke, where the government basically keeps the peace, is not the type of liberalism that we are encountering nowadays. And certainly that should be concerning, and Muslims should be as concerned as everybody else about this concept. When it comes to my advice to people in general who take the role of preachers, teachers, parents, healers, counselors, and so on, I think that we do, as pointed out before, by your esteemed panelists, we need to basically concentrate more on the foundational beliefs, the worldview, basically the worldview that we Muslims have to inculcate in our children is about the answer to the sort of the main existential questions of the origin, the destiny, and the journey. And that is basically God, resurrection, and prophethood. Where did we come from? Where are we going? What are we here for? And like, who should guide us back to our destiny? And if we really focus on this, I think that, and have a strong foundation, I think that many things will fall in place for our children, and they will have basically purpose and objectives, or an ultimate objective in life, and things will fall in place. I would basically say to the parents that they need to actually familiarize themselves with the different phases of child development. I think that this is worth their investment to understand how a 2-year-old may sort of comprehend things versus an 11-year-old. You know, when we talk about operational thinking, when we talk about the different phases that children go through, and how do you address them and through the different phases. So a child before 11 or 12 years of age, they don't have abstract operational thinking. So you may need to basically speak to them in clear terms, black and white. You know, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ وَإِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا. When they ask you about, you know, wine and gambling, say there are benefits in them and there are harms, and the harms outweigh the benefits. I don't think that this is appropriate for a child that is 7 years of age, for instance. You need to just give them clarity and direction, and then when they reach the level of operational abstract thinking or abstract operational thinking, then you want basically to talk to them about the nuance of the different types of discussions and intricacies and so on and so forth. A child who has, or an adolescent who has a same-sex attraction, I think that your esteemed panelists have already talked about this. This is a test by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It should be framed in this way. This is a test. People who have heterosexual attraction also are being tested all the time, before marriage and even after marriage. Everybody is being tested. No one is not being tested. The life of this world in and of itself is a test. الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم. He who created life and death to test you. So life and death, the contradictions, everything was created basically for this particular purpose. We are here for this purpose, to be tested in this life. So I would say that you know, an adolescent who's having difficulties, you need to be sensitive to their difficulties for sure, but you also need to be clear on the message that you're giving across to them. You know, Islamic teachings should be clear. We should not compromise on them. We don't have the right to compromise on them. And you aptly started by وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. So it is not befitting of a believing man or woman when Allah and His Messenger decides on a matter that they have any choice about this matter. So this is something, if they grew up with this concept in mind, it will be easier for them when they have any difficulty, such as this difficulty or any other difficulty, to come back and tell them, so here what it is. This is a test, and this is basically, these are the tools that we have to address this test.
Sheikh Hatem Al-Had. So in essence, reality is that, again, it goes back to that resilience factor, doesn't it? In terms of recognizing your identity as a Muslim, realizing that once you have assigned yourself as being a Muslim, then clearly you now do ittiba Allah, ittiba Rasul, you basically follow Allah and His Rasul. In that sense, that sort of relationship that you have with your faith becomes a paramount element of how you navigate yourself through many different sort of issues that you come across in life. And one of those important paradigms is that we're here for the akhirah. So this place here that we're living in is a test. It's a testing ground. And sometimes that can be quite difficult for children to really grasp, especially when they don't see that in their parents. When they see their parents really attached to the dunya, it becomes quite difficult for them to sort of express that. What I'm going to do is now, I'm just going to move to some questions. I know we've got sort of going over time, but I think these are important questions. And I like our panelists to address some of these questions. So maybe, Sheikh, since you're here and I'm talking to you at the moment, maybe you can address this question. The question is about mutashabihat regarding a male trying to imitate a woman, female trying to imitate a man. The question arises from Wajid. He's asking, imitating, can you expand on this? Is this for transgenders or for any people that are not feminine or masculine in their gender? And he says that, please can we clarify imitating? Sometimes it's natural being for a man to come across as a feminine sort of characteristics, vice versa. Do you want to elaborate on that point, just to clarify that point?
Yeah, alhamdulillah. So this is one of the misconceptions, that Islam restricts the spectrum of your behavior so much that you have to behave in a certain way, like in a certain way that is pretty much pre-programmed by your parents or by the society. And one of the things that people bring up when we talk about LGBTQ issues, they talk about, you know, the history and Islamic history, and they talk about accommodation of certain behaviors. Of course, you know, in our Islamic history, basically what was punishable is a particular act. The evidentiary standard for which is very strict, and aside from that, you know, a wide spectrum of behaviors were tolerated, not necessarily celebrated, but a wide spectrum of behavior was tolerated within the Muslim community. And when the Prophet ﷺ speaks about men who imitate women, he speaks about a willful behavior. He does not speak about sort of a disposition that some people have, or a natural way of speaking, or a natural way of walking or talking that some people may exhibit. He's talking about a willful behavior where a man imitates the walk, the talk, the behavior of a woman, or vice versa. And in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was so merciful to us that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Inna Allah tajawaza li an ummati al-khata' wa nisyan wa mastakriha alayh." And also the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Ma haddatha," you know, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had pardoned my ummah for that which basically their passing thoughts, even the passing thoughts. "Ma haddathat bihi anfusahum ma lam takallam aw ta'mal bihi." So as long as they don't act upon it, or they basically speak about it or act upon it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgiven us for errors, for forgetfulness, for that which we do under compulsion. And under compulsion does include basically natural dispositions, you know, things that we can have no control over, such as, you know, many people have a certain way. Many very honorable men, they speak in a way that may be considered by other men as effeminate, you know.
Yeah. Societal norm, isn't it? That it's perceived that way. Yeah, it's a societal norm that they perceive that way. Yeah,
perceived that way. So
yeah.
Certainly, what the Prophet ﷺ was condemning is a willful imitation of the other gender.
That's right. So in essence, in a'mal biniyat, so somebody who's doing it with that intention that they are trying to imitate an agenda clearly, then that would be something that would be liable for. So just moving on to the next question, and I suppose this goes to Sheikh Fadil in particular. It says a lot of movies and books, somebody who's who can address this, and books have LGBT as part of them. So we watch a lot of adverts. We go down. We're in London and we're going through the tunnels and we see these images of homosexual sort of images there and so forth. So how do we how do you address this? How do we work around that? Because do we protect them against this? How do we protect them? Because it's everywhere. So I suppose the question from this attendee is, how do we deal with that? How much protection are we going to use? Yeah.
Well, actually, this is also one of them, by the way. My homophobic dad. Yeah, and others here, swinger party, mom and dad stuff that is very, very dangerous and disgusting, actually. It is actually a big challenge, as I told you. It will not be possible that you protect your children from seeing that, from reading that, but you need to increase in them the critical thinking. Children themselves need to know what's happening around them. Why are they targeting them? Why don't they just leave boys as boys and girls as girls? Why do they want both to change? So they need to understand that they need to protect themselves. And by also teaching the children certain principles, logical principles, where they can judge what is said to me is right or wrong, and what is the agenda of this person to say that, and so on. So this is what we need to do. And at the same time, I need to be the closest friend of my children, so that when my children are thinking of something, they come and share it with me without any fear of any punishment here. Don't be the friend of your children. A person now asked, you said we need to befriend our children, so how can we set boundaries then so that they can keep respect with us? Did this affect Prophet Muhammad by being on his knees, putting his children on his back negatively? Actually, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the substitute father for 13 other children, because when children lose their fathers, they need a male figure to be a substitute father, someone from their family, or a stepfather. So actually, when women come and tell me, I lost my husband and I'm not gonna get married and live to raise my children, I tell her, no, get married for the sake of your children, but choose a good husband who can be the substitute father. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the substitute father for 13 children. Actually, we learned about his body language from one of them. I read a very beautiful hadith in Subul al-Huda wal-Rashad fi Hadi Khair al-Ibad about his body language, that when he used to point with the palm hand, not with the finger like that, and he used to turn it like this and hit with the right hand the palm of his left. Who told us this? Hind ibn Abi Hala. And this name really struck me. Hind ibn should be Hind bint, because Hind is a female name. No, Hind is a boy. And he is the son of Abu Hala. Hala is also a female name. So why, if Hind is a boy, he's not called Abu Hind? Why Abu Hala? Actually, Hind and Hala, both of them are males, are boys. And they are who? They are the sons of Lady Khadija from her previous husband, Abu Hala. So the Prophet ﷺ was for them not just a stepfather that they hate. No, he was someone that they looked for, to the extent that we learned his body language from them. They loved him. They looked up to him. So this is the issue. We need to be the friends of our children. Wallahi, this will protect them from atheism and also falling into the sin of the alphabet.
Role modeling is important here, isn't it? Role modeling is very, very important.
Role modeling and being friends at the same time, because some people think that role model is to be arrogant and to to shout and to no. Be the friend of your children. Play with them.
Okay, so Brother Yusuf, I've got a question for you. So from Alia Brown, she's basically asking a question. I'm going to frame it a bit different. She said, why aren't scholars or duat mentioning this verse of the Quran related to Lut, 𝐁𝐸, etc.? It feels it should be viral. It's important for people to know. I see the verse of Lut, but not these. Now, I'm just going to address that from a slightly different angle. you're somebody who I know has been going up and down the country, liaising with makatib teachers, imams of masajid, and I know people are calling upon you to sort of give them some kind of education. Why this sense, what, from your understanding that you're picking up from this, why are ulama, imams, and people from the sort of the faith, why are they so, I'm being careful how I'm choosing my words, but not really heavily active, at the forefront of this? Why is that happening, do you think? Is it because of lack of knowledge on the subject, how to address it, I mean? Or confidence in how to address it? Is it a fear of the legal backlash? Is it a fear of the institutes? Is it a fear of their position as imams?
I think in terms of this issue, I'm receiving a lot more calls from ulama, from imams who are addressing this topic in a way that has never happened before. And I think it's not that the imams and ulama are frightened to speak about this topic. It's that, sometimes there's legal uncertainties around what you can and cannot say. And understandably, some people who have institutions, have masajid, have obligations under the charity law, they have got to think maybe in a way that an individual who's not connected to any institution doesn't have that privilege to not think about. So they have certain constraints, but I see a lot more outward khutbahs, talks about this than ever before. A lot more ulama speaking out about it, speaking to their communities about it, and are just asking for some guidance and support on how to address it in a way that balances between being faithful to what we believe, but without maybe falling foul of the law, which is understandable. But I think I would query.
What advice would you give people like that? Because clearly there is an element of fear embedded within the system. And I mean, for somebody who I have a company of many ulama and imams, and I see that element. There is a fear to address this issue clearly on the minbar. There's a fear of addressing this issue. I mean, I remember there was a khutbah that was written out for imams to during the Pride Month, and very few imams or ulama actually stood on the minbar and addressed that issue. There's a fear in Darulooms, there's a fear in madaris, in masajid, about addressing this and teaching children this, and even Muslim schools. So what advice would you give them in terms of, or do you think there's a sense of education that they need to know, understand the legal system and how they can address this issue?
There's two things here. One is, the more we don't speak about an issue, the more we normalize not speaking about an issue. The more we say, I'm not going to speak about it, it almost gives an idea, an impression that we can't speak about it. And actually, some people build assumptions about what we can and cannot say, which is problematic in itself. But I think when I advise imams and ulama to speak, when they want to speak about this issue, I just say, look, you have to ensure that when you speak, you're speaking about it in a way which talks about the phenomenon, the behavior, the actions that are forbidden. And you're not and actually you have to, because of the nature of the law, you have to make clear that you're not in any way trying to say to people that they have to take action against people who identify as that. And we live in a diverse society, and some people will identify as gay, identify as lesbian, identify as one of the LGBTQ labels. And I give my own example. In my last workplace, my last two managers were identified as gay. And I spoke to them about the work that I do, and they had no problem with that. And I spoke to them, this is what I talk about. I go in the mosque, I speak about these issues. And when one of them left, he said, oh, you've been one of the best employees who I've managed. Because the reality is, we don't treat people according to these labels. We don't say to this person, oh, you're an atheist, I'm going to treat you like that. You identify as gay, I'm going to treat you like that. You're an alcoholic, I treat you like that. No, we treat people like human beings. And the labels themselves don't really characterize the way we approach people, the justice or injustice we serve upon people. If my neighbor is an atheist, that doesn't mean that he has fewer rights than if he wasn't. I still have to fulfill my responsibilities to them. So I think in a masjid setting where imams are speaking about this, they need to just make clear, look, we're not talking about this about attacking people who identify as gay or even treating them harshly. But what we're saying is that there's certain moral values that we believe in about relationships, and that the only relationship we recognize as being legitimate is a relationship between a man and a woman in marriage, and that's it. Nikah is the only thing that is acceptable in terms of in our sexual ethics, our sexual behavior, and that we don't accept and we dislike the behaviors which go outside of that moral.
I suppose that what that is a practical example of a peaceful coexistence, what 𝐁𝐜𝐚𝐿𝐲 has basically mentioned in the narrative, and that is that we have a problem with the affair, the action of homosexual acts, but not with the fa'il, the people who undergo those acts, because they are human beings equal to us in that sense. And just like we don't attack a person who's alcoholic or somebody who's promiscuous in sexual immorality in many other ways, we sort of identify in the sense that this goes against our moral code, and those acts are the problem in essence, not the people themselves. So we can live in a community with people like this and engage with them in a certain way, but yet we are very clear on our stance on this issue. Now that sounds fair, but some people can misunderstand that, and that's where the problem arises, or they can't see examples of that so that they can relate to. And maybe we need role modeling in terms of Muslims who are very clear about their identity on this issue, but yet they work
to a certain extent,
they're exposed to those kind of people.
But to add to a certain extent, we've got to call out this liberal intolerance.
Yes.
There's this almost this charade that we all have to be party to and observe, where people say, okay, you can believe, we live in a secular society, a liberal society, you can believe what you want to believe as long as you accept what the legislators accept to be laws in that land. And so moral perspectives, you can believe whatever moral perspective you like. But now the reality is that the LGBT lobby have not just been saying we want equality under the law, we want to be treated. They're saying we want you to accept our moral perspectives as though, and just almost whitewash any idea that you have a different moral perspective. Our moral truths are default values for society, and we've got to challenge that and say no. In what type of free society do you ever force moral perspectives on any individual? There's one thing to accept that the law should be followed by everybody, but there's another thing to say my moral truths are your moral truths. We're always going to differ, and we've just got to find ways of overcoming those differences and living together in a society of difference.
Okay, Jazakallah. Okay, so time's run out. We've gone quite well above time, so inshallah we're going to finish on this. Before we finish, I'm just going to mention a couple of things. And before I do that, I just want to thank our panelists for all their time, for their efforts, for their work that they're doing is immense. Alhamdulillah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you immensely in the work that you're doing, inshallah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala place immense barakah in the efforts that you are pursuing in this very, very important cause. Now, on the remit of this, there's just something else that I want to do, and that is I just want to talk about a course. So parents have really approached us as Balagh Academy, and not only that, we've had people in the community that have approached us about gaining some sense of confidence and understanding this particular topic. So we have a course. So if I get the admin just to put up here the web page to the course that we will be delivering, inshallah, shortly. If I can get that admin to do that, if you can just share that course list with us. I'm struggling a bit trying to get this online at the moment, so. If you can do that, admin. So there's a course, and on this course we have a number of areas of discussion that we're going to do. So this is the LGBT and RSC relationship sex education. So there's a specific relationship in terms of what it means to have relationship sex education within this particular course. So if you just scroll around there, so we get a bit of an idea about the topics that will be in this course. If you look down the course, you'll see that there are a number of topics that we'll be addressing. So here, it's important for us to understand the history of LGBT. We cannot really truly address the issue generally until we understand the history of how this arose, how it developed over time, and now how it's become a big area within even school education. Then also understanding LGBT and liberalism. How does it link in with the political climate of liberalism? How do we decode liberalism and understand how LGBT relates to that? A very important thing, sometimes we don't talk about it in its link to feminism, but there's a very close relationship between LGBT and feminism. So this is another very, very important area that will be discussed. There's also what is the Muslim narrative on LGBT and how to address it. So this is about really getting down to the kind of language that we use in addressing concerns around LGBT. So this is, in essence, this course is valuable for ulama, for imams, for parents, for anybody who has an interest in this particular area, teachers even. And also, there's an important element of this in terms of relating the issue of LGBT to Islamic rulings. Some of the things that we haven't talked about today is, for example, what we call khuntha mushkil, khuntha ghair mushkil. These are elements of hermaphrodites and people like that who Islam does identify with, but recognizing certain rulings related to them. Importance of heterosexual nikah in Islam. So, okay, we've talked about homosexuality, but what about heterosexual relationships? But yet forming that within the unit of Islam and a marital sort of system. So how does that relate? How do we talk about that more thoroughly? Because we're talking about the negative elements, so let's talk about the positive elements about what Islam, in essence, promotes in terms of heterosexual relationships. Then finally, what to do when you and others are confused about gender? So how do we address these issues? So this is about people who are confused, about communities who are confused, a group of people are confused, whichever way, but there is an element of confusion that exists. How do we define and make clarity, bring clarity to this element of confusion? There's something about how to address LGBT education in schools and madrasas specifically. So this is more focused around resources. So I know there's a couple of questions around resources, what kind of resources to use, how do you address this, how do you become active parents, dealing with the governors of your school, directly with the school itself, in an amicable way, but yet addressing something that's concerning. Also, LGBT and Islamic counseling. So this, we've talked about, how we deal with the issue at hand, but there are concerns, because the concern is, what if children come back and say that I identify myself in this way, or you have relatives or people like that who come to you? How do you address that? So there is an Islamic approach of how we should address that. So Islamic counseling in relation to that, that's an important area. And then finally, the last sessions are on spiritual approach to LGBT. So this is about, okay, we've used reason in how we address the issues around LGBT, but there's also spirituality. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Kunu ma'as sadiqeen. That's a spiritual concept. Let's be with the righteous people, the truthful people. Be with those kind of people. So there's something about sitting in the company of people who would have an impact on you, so that it attracts you to a more spiritual understanding and how you relate to this particular topic. So you can see it's a very holistic course. And the idea behind this course is to bring a sense of confidence in those individuals who will take up this course and understand it from that perspective, in how they would address this with their children, as parents, at schools, and also in the general community overall, and also people of a certain position like imams, how they would address the congregation. So inshallah, hopefully the course will be very useful. Please do think about signing up to this course. There's a lot of questions we haven't addressed. A lot of that will be addressed in this course. Some of our panelists here that you see will be some of the speakers on those courses, some of the instructors there, and this will be a fantastic opportunity for you to really gain a deep insight into this really important topic. Now, there are, just as a promotional element, if I just pull up my slides again, just one second. So there are a couple of other courses that we have, some related, some not directly related. But these courses, in essence, address some other important areas within this area. So we got the fiqh of medicine, okay. We got also the fiqh of psychology, psychiatry, and counseling, and one of those areas in that do talk about areas around LGBT and various other things around there. We've got our online Alamiya program, and we've got the Hifz al-Quran program. So those of you who are not very familiar with Al-Balagh Academy, and I know that many of you aren't, this is an opportunity for you to join some of the other courses. Please browse around our website, have a look at some of the new courses that are about to come up. And in these courses, we go into quite a bit of detail about many, many other topics. So, Jazakallah khair, we'll leave it at that point, for all your time, your effort, and finally, most importantly, for our panelists, for their times and efforts for them to be involved in this conversation. There's a lot more to be said about this, and inshallah, we need to be active in the sense that we engage with this discussion, not only amongst ourselves as a family discussion, but also addressing this in our schools. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.